Joshua 10:16-28 records the capture and execution of the five Amorite kings who had united against Israel. At first glance, the passage appears to be primarily about military victory and judgment, but it also reveals deeper themes concerning the triumph of God's kingdom, the certainty of divine justice, and the complete removal of opposition to God's covenant purposes. The narrative begins with the five kings hiding in a cave at Makkedah after their armies had been routed. Joshua commands that large stones be rolled over the cave's entrance and guards stationed there while Israel continues pursuing the enemy. This detail emphasizes that the victory was already assured. The kings were trapped and powerless long before their final judgment was carried out. Their fate had been decided because God had already delivered them into Israel's hands. This picture illustrates a recurring biblical theme. God's enemies may appear to remain active for a time, but their defeat has already been determined. Throughout Scripture, evil is often portrayed as awaiting its final exposure and removal. The cave becomes a symbol of the temporary concealment of powers that stand against God's reign. When the pursuit ends, Joshua brings the kings out of the cave and calls the leaders of Israel to place their feet upon the necks of the defeated rulers. This was a public demonstration that God had subdued the enemies of his people. The act was not intended to exalt human power, but to strengthen Israel's confidence in the Lord's faithfulness. Joshua immediately reminds the people that God will continue to do the same to all their enemies. The imagery points beyond the conquest itself. Throughout Scripture, the placing of feet upon enemies symbolizes complete victory and authority. God's kingdom ultimately triumphs over every force that opposes his purposes. What Israel experienced physically foreshadowed a greater spiritual reality in which all opposition to God's rule would be brought under his authority. Joshua then encourages the leaders with the words, "Do not be afraid or dismayed. Be strong and courageous." These words echo the repeated commands given to Joshua earlier in the book. The victory over the kings served as evidence that God's promises were dependable. Israel's courage was to rest not in military strength, but in the certainty that God was accomplishing what he had promised. The execution of the five kings demonstrates the seriousness of divine judgment. The kings represented rebellious nations that had hardened themselves against God's purposes. Their downfall was not arbitrary, but the culmination of persistent opposition to the covenant God. The passage reveals that God does not ignore evil indefinitely. His justice may appear delayed, but it is never absent. From a covenantal perspective, these events also anticipate the transition from the old age into the fullness of God's kingdom. Throughout Israel's history, earthly enemies often represented larger spiritual realities. The conquest narratives portray the removal of obstacles that stood against God's redemptive plan. As the biblical story unfolds, the focus shifts from physical warfare to the complete establishment of God's reign through the Messiah. The hanging of the kings on trees until evening, and their subsequent burial in the cave from which they had emerged, serves as a powerful conclusion. The very place that had been their refuge became their tomb. Their attempt to escape judgment only led to a more public demonstration of their defeat. The stones placed over the cave became a lasting testimony to God's victory. The passage ultimately points to the certainty that God's kingdom prevails. Human rulers, earthly powers, and every form of opposition eventually pass away, but God's purposes remain. Joshua 10:16-28 therefore stands as a testimony that the Lord faithfully fulfills his promises, establishes his reign, and brings every enemy under his authority. What began as a military victory in Canaan serves as a larger picture of the complete triumph of God's covenant purposes and the unshakable reign of his kingdom.